Up and down the length of the UK, in towns and cities once characterised by their mines, mills and soot street pubs, and later by their desolate high streets, needle-strewn playgrounds, yet still fastidiously maintained war memorials, a long-suppressed fury is bubbling to the surface. From Epping to Aldershot, Bournemouth to Ballymena, from Manchester, Norwich and Falkirk, to Dover, Cardiff and Clacton-on-Sea, crowds of ever-increasing size and ever-mounting indignation are taking to the streets in protest at the waves of Third World savagery being inflicted upon their communities. That many of these new arrivals will go on to assault local women is a grim inevitability. The scale of crimes already committed by their predecessors is only now being acknowledged. And yet, while the migrant rape epidemic may have proved the gravest blow to Britain's once towering self-conception, even this is but the crowning indignity in a decades-long humiliation ritual perpetuated across the entirety of Europe. Cowardice, regrettably, has been central to enabling this debasement. Neither can we afford for the roles of apathy, ignorance, complacency and fatalism to be downplayed. However, so too must we recognise the truth, every bit as shameful, that it was the continent's near pathological appetite for altruism which first allowed the barbarian hordes to breach our gates. After all, as both the architects of this invasion and their low IQ imports well know, whites, pedigree unique among the races, have been afflicted with an empathy far exceeding the bounds of our tribe. An empathy so ubiquitous, so pervasive, and so foundational to our civilizational psyche that few even appreciate its presence, much less grasp the depths of its roots. These, it could be contended, stretch all the way into European prehistory, back to the vast steep tundras and post-glacial river valleys where our Paleolithic ancestors lived in small, tight-knit bands. Amid such perilous environments, in which a population of only a few tens of thousands lay scattered across an expanse ranging from the Iberian Peninsula to what is today known as the Black Sea, individuals were left little option but to rely on a cooperative approach to survival. These resources shared, labor coordinated, and winters prepared for collectively. Over generations, these conditions would select for traits such as reliability and reciprocity over short-term opportunism, conditions that, in turn, helped foster a culture, and indeed a temperament, in which trust extended beyond one's most immediate kin. As evolutionary psychologist Kevin MacDonald explains, under ecologically adverse circumstances, adaptations are directed more at coping with the physical environment than at competition with other groups. Evolutionary conceptualizations of ethnocentrism emphasize the utility of ethnocentrism in group competition, but this would be of no importance in combating the physical environment. These uniquely Western tendencies suggest that reciprocity is deeply ingrained. Within these social forms is a tendency to question the legitimacy of others' interests and perspectives, in a manner that is foreign to collectivist, despotic social structures characteristic of much of the rest of the world. Naturally, this would come to be reflected in family dynamics. In contrast to the cousin-marrying, clan-centric systems that proliferated throughout more temperate, resource-rich regions, the reproductive practices of early Europeans proved advantageous, not only from a genetic perspective, but also served to habituate non-relatives into daily collaboration, accelerating the development of interpersonal acumen alongside innovations in hunting, toolmaking, and a litany of other advances no one group could have achieved in isolation. But while such approaches may have enabled our Ice Age forebears to reap the societal and material benefits of interdependency, so too did they demand a then unprecedented faculty for conflict resolution. Aside from habits of food sharing, communal childcare, and consensus-based decision-making, inhabitants of ancient Europe, anthropologists assert, also engaged in the far more radical practices of virtualized reconciliation and reparative exchanges, long-term care of the disabled, and even rotating access to humping grounds. This, suffice to say, was a sense of fairness otherwise alien to the primeval word, although it would nonetheless remain many centuries before such tendencies would be cultivated into a coherent, fully articulated moral philosophy. As with virtually all Western intellectual traditions, this can be traced back to the 5th century BC and the teachings of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, thinkers among the first to recast mankind's capacity for reason and virtue as a species-wide truism, rather than merely the inheritance of one's tribe. Of course, this was far from absolute. The practical realities of the period, such as they were, necessitated that stark distinctions still be drawn between men and women, citizens and slaves, natives and foreigners, although on a purely theoretical level, it was under their philosophical tutelage that citizens of Greece began conceptualizing themselves, albeit tentatively, beneath the overarching banner of human. Stoicism would crystallize this mindset yet further. For the likes of Zeno, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus, and later Cato, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, all rational beings participate in the logos, the principle of order and reason which permeates existence, and are thus bound by and able to live in accordance with the single, supreme moral authority. True law is right reason in agreement with nature, claims Cicero. It is of universal application, unchanging and everlasting. While Epictetus's cosmopolitanism was more comprehensive still, asking, if what philosophers say of the kingship of God then men be true, what remains for man but to do as Socrates did, never to answer the name of Athenian or of Corinthian, but that of a citizen of the universe. But though it may have been the Greeks who laid the metaphysical groundwork for the notions of cosmic unity and the brotherhood of man, it was not until the Romans that such ideals would be codified into a tangible legal framework. The most explicit example of this came in the form of jus giantium, the law of nations, which was devised in order to better govern the many peregrines, or non-citizens, brought under their jurisdiction in the aftermath of the 3 Punic Wars. By proclaiming reason to be the centralmost pillar of its judicial system, what Roman lawmakers effectively established was the earliest civil order which purported to uphold basic humanity as the paramount consideration in justice, and the institution essential to binding together its immense and ethnically diverse empire. As such, most modern historians laud jus giantium as a decisive milestone in the evolution of objective legal standards and, by extension, a seismic and unambiguously positive shift toward the enduring values of the West. What few choose to mention, however, or perhaps the consequence they are unwilling to confront, is the innately destabilizing impact this bureaucratization would have, not just upon Rome, but on all subsequent iterations of the European state, in effect, diluting the primacy of blood as the foremost marker of one's civic identity. However much Greek philosophy and Roman legislature were to shape Europe's still fledgling universalism, there can be little doubt that it was the spread of Christianity which saw this elevated to a sacred moral code. Granted, biblical prescriptions such as love your neighbour and turn the other cheek are today most often employed by non-believers and liberal denominations as a means to further their own decidedly humanistic crusades. That said, even among adherents of a more fire and brimstone persuasion, there can surely be few who would deny that, in the eyes of God, every soul is valuable and salvation is open to all. It was this sense of implicit human dignity which compel the Christians to first identify with the suffering of others and ultimately seek to alleviate it. Hospitals, orphanages, ecclesiastical charities, souk kitchens and almshouses proliferated throughout Europe in numbers which far surpassed anything prior to the Middle Ages, their work funded by donations offered as acts of solidarity and penance. Eventually, this ethos would be imbued with papal authority in the form of liber extra, Gregory IX decreeing the Church, whenever the specific circumstances of their birth, to be a single unified body. As political philosopher Larry Segenhope notes in Democracy in Europe, Christianity took humanity as a species in itself and sought to convert it into a species for itself. It aimed to create a single human society, a society composed, that is, of individuals rather than tribes, clans, or castes. The fundamental relationship between the individual and his or her God provides the crucial test in Christianity of what really matters. It is, by definition, a test which applies to all equally. Hence, the deep individualism of Christianity was simply the reverse side of its universalism. The Christian conception of God became the means of creating the brotherhood of man, of bringing to self-consciousness the human species, by leading each of its members to see him or herself as having, at least potentially, a relationship with the deepest reality, that both required and justified the equal moral standing of all humans. The most distilled expression of this was manifested in the Protestant Reformation. With his emphasis on sola fide and sola scriptura, faith alone and scripture alone, Martin Luther recalibrated Christian focus from cleric-led spiritual meditation toward the believer's direct accountability before God, with goodwill towards one's neighbours serving as the external sign of personal devotion. This ethic underpinned much of what Max Weber called the inner world asceticism of the Puritans, a form of religious liturgy which advocated disciplined self-restraint in conjunction with an aggressively expansionistic duty of care. Slavery in particular became a principally Protestant concern. As early as the 1700s, both Quakers and evangelicals had been at the forefront of abolitionist efforts in Britain, the Netherlands, and the American colonies, with several high-ranking Calvinist figures already framing slavery as a sin to be eradicated in the name of national redemption. Admittedly, not even the most ardent of these emancipationists ever regarded blacks, or indeed any other indentured group, to be their equals in any sense except for the spiritual. And yet, it is not difficult to see how their interpretation of Christ's all-embracing gospel would set into motion a soon-to-prove powerful engine for race-blind societal reform. Within the Western civilizational narrative, the Enlightenment is most often remembered, at least insofar as it is remembered at all, as a resolutely secular movement, Europe casting off the shackles of superstition and religious dogma as it burst forth into a triumphant new age of reason and scientific inquiry. Needless to say, this constitutes but half the story. Whether demonstrated by John Locke's theory of natural rights, or the social contract presented by Rousseau, Voltaire's championing of civil liberties, or Hume's unwavering empiricism, at its ideological core, the humanitarian impulses of the Enlightenment can be read as a demystified offshoot of Protestant pluralism, Kant's categorical imperative, perhaps the clearest illustration of this through line. In practice, his declaration that one should act only according to that maxim where you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law echoes quite conspicuously Jesus' command to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, even if his formulation translated Christianity's golden rule into the language of logic and a priori reasoning. The late 18th century would see this mantra consecrated as poetical reality. In the wake of the French and American revolutions, ideals espoused during the Enlightenment would be codified in charters and constitutions which, for the first time, defined national identity in terms of abstract principles rather than ancestral lineage. This was hardly unbounded. In both instances, full citizenship was restricted on the basis of race as well as gender. However, whether granted to native or naturalized white men, this new sense of civic belonging engendered a climate in which tribal loyalties were not merely denigrated as vestiges of a parochial past, but as active impediments to cultural cohesion. Within such a paradigm, there were no natural parameters to the West's ethical obligations. For many, this circle could and indeed should be widened indefinitely. Australian philosopher Peter Singer observing, "Reasoning is inherently expansionist. It seeks universal application. Unless crushed by countervailing forces, each new application will become part of the territory of reasoning bequeathed to future generations. Left to itself, reasoning will develop in a principle similar to biological evolution. For generation after generation, there may be no progress. Then suddenly there is a mutation which is better adapted than the ordinary stock, and that mutation establishes itself and becomes the base level for future progress." The rise of industrialization, and with it, the re-emergence of empire, would see this mutation metastasize into nothing less than a global political project. Throughout much of the 19th century, British and French authorities justified their incursions into Africa, Oceania, Indochina, and the subcontinent as a mission civilisatrice, an endeavour grounded in the belief that Western values, institutions, and governance represented the apex of political advancement. Britain in particular pursued what has been referred to as liberal imperialism, the spread of free trade, the rule of law, and the imposition of administrative order promoted as the chief objectives of colonial rule. Historian Duncan Bell, on the other hand, offers more critical depiction. Liberal imperialism is usually understood to centre on the civilizing mission, the idea that liberal states have a right, and, in a strong version of the argument, a duty, to spread civilization to the purportedly non-civilized peoples of the world. Societies are arrayed along and judged according to their position on a single developmental trajectory, where both the logic and pace of change, as well as the status to be realized, are characterized in terms of progress. Although this vision allows for considerable variation within each category, crossing the threshold from barbarity to civilization is conceived of as a monumental step, one which, depending on the version of the argument employed, will either take an inordinate amount of time given prevailing social and political conditions, or will be impossible without exogenous assistance. Yet the same universalist convictions that had once legitimized colonial oversight would be profoundly casted, and in many ways fatally undermined, by the convulsions of the 20th century. The cataclysms of the two world wars would force many within the West to reckon with the most enduring assumptions about the previous age. The Holocaust, or more precisely, how the Holocaust is being memorialized, enshrined as the defining moral parable of the ensuing century. After 1945 and the trials at Nuremberg, ethno-nationalism became widely discredited within both political and academic discourse. The rhetoric of cultural purity and racial kinship replaced by the far more humanistic language of the United Nations. Against this backdrop, the disintegration of Europe's long-standing empires was continuing to gather pace. Begun by conflict, burdened by economic strife, and confronted by rising nationalist sentiments throughout their territories, imperial powers found themselves under mounting pressure, both from abroad and within, to relinquish control over their once vaunted colonies. Their ostensibly paternalistic approach to global governance now regarded, in the eyes of a war-weary populace, as a political liability, if not an ongoing moral failure. Not that the continent's ruling elite had any intention of surrendering their influence so readily. Rescripting their rule, not as bearers of civilization, but rather as stewards of atonement, bodies such as the UN and leader NATO set about appointing themselves purveyors of post-colonial justice, the legacies of conquest, slavery and segregation now redefined as debts to be repaid through corrective foreign and domestic policies. The listener likely has little need to be reminded of just how disastrous these policies have proved. Between its ruinous military interventions, hubristic diplomatic entanglements, and of course, the black hole of financial aid, Europe, as well as the West more broadly, has spent the better part of a century systematically hobbling itself in the name of uplifting those who possess neither the desire nor the capacity to be uplifted. For the most part, it is a rule whites have accepted unquestioningly. Be it a remnant from our evolutionary past, a product of our Christian heritage, or an unholy convergence of Enlightenment ideals and post-colonial guilt, the people of Europe, alongside their Anglosphere cousins, have retained the purest faculty for altruism, even in the face of mockery, cultural desecration, frequent terrorist attacks, and most intolerable of all, the industrial-scale rape of women and children. But at long last, it would seem that we have reached the limits of what this millennia-entrenched empathy can endure. While it might be the UK where this pushback is most apparent, throughout the Western world, in numbers far greater than the government corporate hegemon will ever acknowledge, whites are coming together to articulate, in the only language left available to them, that they are no longer willing to pay for a debt they never incurred. Whether the multicultural Rubicon has already been crossed remains to be seen. What we do know, however, beyond any shadow of a doubt, is that neither our megalomaniacal controllers nor their boat roads of third world foot soldiers have any intention of halting the onslaught. Instead, they will continue to come in ever greater numbers and with ever greater hostility until the day comes when at last the white man, for so long the moral custodian of humanity, finally shakes off the bonds of his compassion and once again remembers how to hate. Hi everyone, and thanks an awful lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate if you could give it a like or a share. I can't tell you how much that helps. Well, if you're interested in seeing others like it, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Alternatively, you can always find more of my written work over on Substack, the link for which is in the description. Thanks again for your time.